welcome to Historia Canadiana. My name is Patrick. This is a podcast about Canadian culture, usually literary based, and the way it interprets and informs this nation's history. Today, we're beginning a broad coverage of a genre of literature that is central to understanding Canada, that is, exploration writings. We are going to be getting into the early days of the colonies in this multi-part series that will take us through the European side of contact with the Native American populations, as well as tales of survival and the establishment of some of the major hubs, populations, and trading systems that helped solidify the colony and later the nation of Canada. This episode is going to be the first part of a series covering the significant oeuvres of exploration writing, starting with the multi-volume work known in French as Les Voyages de Samuel de Champlain, which is translated very easily to The Voyages of Samuel de Champlain. Before we start this episode, I do want to warn the listeners that my pronunciation of Champlain varies wildly throughout the episode, mostly because I flip-flop between pronouncing it in French and English, and my accent just kind of goes bonkers. I'm sorry for any confusion that might add. Sometimes I say Samuel de Champlain, sometimes I say Samuel de Champlain. Regardless, it's the same person, obviously. I just wanted to add this little disclaimer so that your ears can, get used to the wild changes. Anyway, on with the show. While it is not as thrilling or emotional to read these tales when compared to some of the other works I've already covered, they must be covered because of how these texts demonstrate just how unforgiving and difficult life would have been for the first settlers. The harsh and destructive winters, the wars, and the unbearably vast size of the territory would have discouraged most people, including yours truly, from ever setting foot in this country ever again. Yet, thanks to these volumes, many of which can still be found online or in print, by the way, we get a sense of the life of those who did stay and survive. So, without much further ado, let's dive into our first exploration text, Les Voyages de Samuel de Champlain. I guess the proper way to start this is by defining what exactly exploration literature is. As the name indicates, the goal of this type of writing is to emphasize what the writer or explorer sees or experiences during his or her voyages. It emphasizes their experiences in a strange or unknown territory. There is often a kind of romanticizing that occurs with these forms of literature. For one, on the explorer's part, a certain form of exaggeration is to be expected so as to make their contributions to the knowledge of the world all the more impressive and relevant. Such writers almost become their own type of hype men, if you will. The more territories, cultures, and peoples they discover, the more importance the explorers are given. Furthermore, the more their works contribute to the survival of later inhabitants of the undiscovered country, the more the work itself will be remembered as valuable and necessary. In spite of the problems that reading such literature can provide in terms of bias and cultural interpretations by outsider societies, I don't think it is so easy to ignore this genre out of hand. The very nature of the writing is important because these are the first written descriptions we have of what would become Canada, and they highlight a very important aspect of the Canadian identity, that is, survival. As much as we would like to have first-hand oral accounts of what life was like pre-European settlement, this is nigh impossible, and the best we can go off is written accounts of initial perceptions of the Canadian landscape and Indigenous people. You could also get transcripts from missionaries of Native people telling them what life was like, although those are a bit harder to find nowadays. To a certain extent, these writings try to describe what is witnessed by people like Samuel de Champlain. The way it is written will sometimes have you believe that this would be an untouched version of native lives, but we now understand that this is also impossible. In the advent of even a minimal amount of contact, native lives or the environment would have been changed by European presence in both good and bad ways, and this is indicative of any type of historical or anthropological writing that tries to approximate as closely as possible what a world would look like from a completely detached view. But these often fail from the start because of the situation that allows such an observation to take place. Right? By the very fact that, in this case, these European outsiders are observing, there's already a contact that changes the perception of that society that they are observing. All this to say that Champlain and other exploration writers are not an infallible source. They, like any other writers, describe one version of events. We have to rely on them, or we choose to rely on them, rather, because we have to. And we will be getting into the veracity of Champlain's specific writings later. As for the survival aspect that I mentioned earlier, this is an interesting point to stop on for a bit, and we'll return to it later. As we mentioned in episode 1 of this podcast, Canada has often been described as a country built and identified with its survival mechanisms and the way it constantly struggles for a place within the world. In the context of early settlers, it was a very physically oriented form of survival, with nature, sickness, and war being a constant preoccupation. Later, the survivability of Canada was seen through terms of identity, right? Native Americans in the light of European conquest, French Canadians in the midst of British invasions, a more culturally diverse Canada in relation to the United States of America. I can go on, but I think the point is clear here. Exploration literature is my way of introducing this concept in a more concrete and formal way, right? In a more chronological fashion. It's a way of saying that survival mechanisms in Canada form almost a basis of an identity from long before modern writers started talking about it. So in the current episode, we are in the context of New France, which was the name attributed to the territory controlled by the French until 1763 when the British took over. In this context, exploration literature forms the major part of writings related to this period of history. The only other styles worthy of mention would be poetry or theatre, with the latter's most well-known writer on the continent at the time being Marc Lescarbot, who actually traveled with Champlain for a bit and wrote what is considered one of the first plays on the North American soil, and definitely the first one in Canada, or what would become Canada. Exploration literature was produced by leaders of expeditions, missionaries, or sometimes ghostwriters, and as such, exact attribution of the events claimed is often unclear or impossible to determine. Multiple genres, including utopic, satire, or autobiography, are often used as vessels that relate events from a variety of sources or from the claimed writer's personal experiences. It must be remembered as well that these books were meant to be sold back in the homeland. So embellishments and flowery writing is par for the course in exploration literature, especially when aimed at a public that knows little to nothing about New France. You could get away with writing a whole lot of nonsense, especially if it is not actually your name on the book's cover. Continuing onward, we must keep in mind that questions of veracity and plagiarism are peppered into most of these books, including those by Samuel de Champlain. For example, if you want a more concrete example of wild storytelling in exploration literature, you can just look at Marco Polo's work. Right, there's a great episode of Our Fake History that already covered that, but I'm just opening that out there if you want a really great example of embellishments for the sake of creating a bestseller. To summarize, the literature we will be covering over the next few episodes is about discovery, survival, identity, and most importantly, how all of these are written about, and why it is important for explorers to talk about specific aspects that wound up in their publication. In the previous episode, we covered the Native perspective on the continent through Alanis Obumsawin's album Bush Lady. Much of this album refers to how Native American lives were changed and are continuing to be affected by Canada's colonial past and present. Before we get into Champlain's writing properly, I want to very, very briefly cover what the pre-colonial context made the North American continent look like. I cannot emphasize enough that this is a summary, the likes of which would barely qualify as Cliff Notes for a high school book report. This is really just to give some vague context before getting into the main subject of today's episode. As you might certainly expect, multiple groups of Native Americans existed on this territory, both before and after the arrival of Europeans, and still to this day. These nations had different cultures, languages, and traditions, and interacted with each other through trade, cultural exchange, and war like any other society throughout the world. One major conception about native tribes that I want to dispel is that they were all primitive hunter-gatherers. This is very different from the truth, as even pre-contact, indigenous populations throughout the continent had complex cultures, systems of government, and societies that were just as functional and interesting as other peoples across the globe. For the sake of simplicity, I will concentrate on the groups that were present around the St. Lawrence River in what is today southern Quebec and the northeastern USA, which is a big part of where Samuel de Champlain mostly traveled around. We find groups like the Cree, the Malecite, and the Micmac, which are a small part of what is commonly referred to as the Algonquin linguistic family. Nations such as the Mohawk and the Oneida, who were also present in this part of Canada, were among the Iroquoian linguistic family. So right off the bat, we see these divergences in terms of methods of speech. Where the individual groups I just mentioned were initially considered fully distinct from one another, we now know that coalitions of nations were formed into larger groups that are called leagues in English. For example, the Iroquois League was formed of those who spoke an Iroquoian dialect and shared a relatively common culture. You might hear this group being referred to as the Haudenosaunee, which is a Mohawk word, and I think is currently the preferred word in reference to this nation. Now, coalitions and league formation was done for much the same reasons as we form associations today. The promise of security and the identification of the people who compose this group with common and cultural traits. The Iroquois League is a good example of this, as they tended to be a more sedentary type of people, with their name sometimes being translated to people of the extended houses, which is a reference to their style of oblong homes which fits multiple families inside. Other nations, on the other hand, such as the Algonquins, lived more nomadic lives, as well as speaking a different dialect, as I mentioned previously. As such, groups had different eating habits and daily lives, and were honestly, at this point, a different society altogether. They coexisted on the same territory, but for all intents and purposes, they were two distinct groups, right? Different language, different habits, so on and so forth. I could go on to explain a whole series of other facts about the various native populations in Canada, which we generally call the First Nations and Inuit in official terms. For example, I could have gone into the exact food they ate or what kind of sports, art, and entertainment they had. And that's all extremely fascinating. But these are unfortunately not the purpose of this episode. What I wanted to do here was establish some important groundwork, that the First Nations and Inuit were a complex and wildly interesting people, that they had their own clearly defined societies and lifestyles, and most importantly, that they did not recognize or even have use of the modern borders that exist today. For example, the one between Canada and the US. It was a way of identifying trading routes, but there was no actual formal border that was recognized, right? The different tribes identified themselves through commonalities, but there was no such thing as the modern nation state that is so present today. Please don't be angry at me if I didn't touch on certain points. I promise that I will get back to them in future episodes that are dedicated specifically to these groups. In moving on to the focus of our episode, we actually know very little about Champlain prior to his becoming a famous explorer. We know that he was born in the small town of Voyages on the west coast of France in approximately 1570. That's right, we're not even certain of the year he was born. If that bothers you, hold on to your butts because this next bit of information might just end you. We also don't know what he looked like. You might be thinking, well, of course we know. There are portraits and statues of him. He had a nice medium-length jet black set of hair and a small thin mustache. Well, actually, the face we associate with Champlain was essentially some French propaganda from the 17th century. The portrait was meant to represent a typically dashing and brave French explorer, and was an image slapped onto pamphlets that incited people to come settle the new world that was North America, specifically to New France for our context. It was only later, in order to put a face to the man, that the image was reinterpreted to be that of Samuel de Champlain. There is only one existing image of the explorer, and that is from an engraving that he would produce himself, depicting a battle between the French soldiers under his command against the Iroquois. The problem with this is that the figures on the piece are so small that Champlain could not draw any facial details. So we actually don't know anything about what he looked like except what he was wearing. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself in this one. Something that must be mentioned about Champlain is that he was not initially known as an explorer or cartographer. We again associate him with this role because of his importance in developing early maps and knowledge of North America, but his primary function from before arriving in New France to his death was as a soldier. In this role, between 1593 and 1603, he worked as a quartermaster and sailor for the French and Spanish crowns. If anything, he was more akin to a mercenary, a soldier taking jobs here and there, using leverage that he had in various courts to get some sweet deals and jobs across the globe. His first expedition into North America was essentially as a surveyor between 1603 and 1607. He and some other French explorers were tasked by the King of France, who at that point was Henry IV, to ensure that the land was capable of sustaining colonization and trade. If necessary, and this is where the need for soldiers for this task comes in handy, Champlain and his men were required to pacify the region. This would be done by either establishing solid trading contacts with native populations or by going into battle with those who refused for whatever reason they chose to. The major trade that Champlain would be involved with at this time, and that would help launch Canada and North America into being quite the economic powers, was fur and pelts, mostly from beavers, which had gone extinct in Europe quite a while before. Champlain himself would be less directly involved with this trade, but I am mentioning it because it is an important factor in the decision by the Europeans to remain in North America. Now, from 1603 to 1604, Champlain charted and surveyed the St. Lawrence Valley and the Atlantic coast from Cape Canso in modern-day Nova Scotia to Cape Cod, which is just off Massachusetts. During this time, he would write the first book that is undoubtedly his, entitled Des Sauvages, which translates directly to On or About Savages. Now, despite the horrendously offensive title, there is a great deal of useful information, a lot of which is considered to be correct. The geography and topography of the St. Lawrence is well accounted for, and Champlain does provide a rather succinct description of Native American groups that were rivals to the Hurons that the French had associated themselves with. Shortly after this, Champlain returned to France in order to report back to his superiors and the king, before being given the mission to return to Canada in 1608 in order to establish permanent settlements in the name of France. This is where our story will converge with the work we are supposed to be focusing on today, and that I keep extending into other stuff, the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain. There are 3 volumes in the series of books published between 1613 and 1632, with the entire Voyages covering Champlain's travels from 1604 all the way to 1631. Now, that's almost a 30-year period that we're going to cover, and we won't be spending a lot of time on the second and third volume compared to the first volume, mostly for reasons of interest and time. Once I cover what the general points and events of each volume are, I propose a quick analysis of the impact that this writing has had on Canada and its history. Note that I said general points. There is no way that I can touch on all the points of Champlain's books, and neither do I want to. My goal here is really to introduce the points that will become significant later in our history, as brought to life by the French explorers' words. The first volume actually features quite a bit of the same material as found in the first book Champlain published about 10 years prior, but with revisions and updates. It describes the period from 1604 to 1612, which, as we'll talk about later, is a time that will see many important aspects of later Canadian history be established. Despite this work being a partial retreading of previous ideas, this volume is considered to be a veritable high watermark in the exploration literature genre, and is often classified as among Champlain's better writings. The reason for this is attributable to the acceptance that it is his most factually accurate piece, but also to the vivid and rich prose that makes what would be a very typical Canadian landscape and environment come to life on the page. Sometimes. We'll talk about that later. For a podcast about history and literature, these descriptions are a must. I'll read you an excerpt to give you an idea. On another, we found the shore completely covered with sea wolves, of which we captured as many as we wished. At the 2 others, there is such an abundance of birds and different sorts that one could not imagine it if he had not seen them. There are cormorants, 3 kinds of ducks, geese, marmots, bustards, sea parrots, snipe, vultures, and other birds of prey, gulls, sea larks of 2 or 3 kinds, herons, large seagulls, curlews, sea magpies, ospreys, ravens, cranes, and other sorts which I am not acquainted with, and which will also make their nests here. We named these Sea Wolf Islands. they are distant from 4 to 5 leagues from the mainland, or Cape Sable. Granted, this was a lot of description of various animals. It sounded more like a grocery list than anything else, but it does give you a sense of the kinds of things that Champlain is noting here. Animals that he has never seen before or that he hasn't seen in a long time. But this is not the most striking aspect of his writing. What would really interest the modern reader as worthy of notice are the episodes that emerge every so often between Champlain's travels and his attempts to establish viable settlements. For example, in 1609, we get a absolutely haunting description of an event that was claimed to have happened in February of that year, where a group of starving natives are crossing the ice that has been formed for many months now due to the insane cold, in search of food and resources in order to survive. Even the peoples who would help Champlain survive through the types of winters that were unfathomable to 17th century Frenchmen had been affected by the weather around them. So you really get quite a variety in the reading of this text. But really, aside from these sporadic episodes, whether it's new animals or descriptions of how natives live, Champlain does not write a lot if he doesn't deem it necessary. So once broad ideas are established, he really skims over some stuff. So sometimes there are these great lengths of time, sometimes 6 months, that are just glossed over in a single sentence. Really, I think it was in 1605, I should have written it down. It was, well, the winter lasts for 6 months here. That's it. That was all he had written about that entire period. And there's really a give or take interest in what he writes, but that doesn't stop us from using the text for various other reasons. What I want to do now is take some time to elaborate on the help that I keep alluding to that natives gave to the French in New France. Much like certain tribes would do elsewhere on the continent within the British or Spanish empires, the native populations knew the territory they inhabited more than anyone else, and they would leverage that knowledge into trade deals or military help of their own. Many of the settlements I'm going to mention, being built in Champlain's time, were able to exist because the Hurons, who were allied to the French, allowed the latter to build on certain grounds in exchange for their help against enemy nations like the Iroquois. We should remember that despite the treatment that the First Nations would go through later, they very much had an advantage over Europeans on how to hunt, survive, and fight in this territory that was completely alien to Champlain and his compatriots. It was also a common practice for Native American populations to provide the much sought-after beaver pelts to the French in exchange of modern weapons. As time would go on, the European powers would monopolize these territorial, military, and economic affairs. But when basing ourselves off of the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain, this was not yet the case. And we get these descriptions of his interactions with the natives every so often saying, okay, I traded this for this, and I'm establishing certain relations and trade deals that will allow us to continue as a colony here. As mentioned a few minutes ago, a couple of major occurrences take place in the period covered in Volume 1 of the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain that will have a massive impact in later Canadian history. The first event I want to touch on is the arrival in 1605, which is during Champlain's initial mission in New France, of French settlers in Acadia, or as it's called in French, l'Acadie. At the time, Acadia was a much bigger part of Canada than it is now, essentially covering from Maine to the Gaspé region, located just above New Brunswick. In 1605, the settlement of Port Royal, was founded in modern-day Nova Scotia, not far from the Bay of Fundy. Port Royal was a failure for the French, as a disastrous winter led to the deaths of most of the 80 men settled there. Champlain, upon his return to Port Royal, helped move the men elsewhere near the Annapolis River, which at the time was known as the Dauphin River. The next year, in 1606, Champlain and his men would actually establish a type of social club known as the Ordre de Bon Temps, which translates to the Order of Good Cheer, which was meant to make the winter all the more palatable. So there were fun and games, and they kind of hoarded some livestock and fruits so that they could have a few days of actually good food before returning to the regular hubbub of settlement. This order would actually see one of the first plays produced in North America that year, the one that I mentioned at the top of the episode. But I mention this whole thing because it is a major point in later Acadian demographics and culture. The people who would later call themselves Acadians were a group of French speakers who would be displaced by the British once they had taken over from the French in the second half of the 18th century. These Acadians, which we will talk about in later episodes, are the remnants of these early settlers and are a proud French community in the east of Quebec and the Maritimes, identifying themselves through the survival of their culture in spite of their forceful displacement. The second event that is especially important in Volume 1 happens in 1608. For those who are aware, I would think, of Canadian history, would recognize that date as the year in which Quebec City was founded. It is somewhat anachronistic to refer to the settlement as a city during this period, since it started out as barely more than a strategic and trading post for the French. I use the term city because I want to make sure that no listener gets confused with the name of the province. We do get more descriptions of life in this settlement in Volume 2, but its establishment takes place in Volume 1. As the later capital of the province of Quebec, this outpost turned fortress turned city becomes one of the greatest and longest lasting military points in North America. It's actually the longest lasting in Canada, with over 400 years of history at this point. Its position along the St. Lawrence River makes it an indispensable place for traders and armies to stop and hold their respective business. And because of that position, Quebec City would rapidly become the center of the French Empire in North America after diplomatic efforts by Champlain and his men would allow its proper establishment, diplomatic efforts with the natives in this case. Champlain would be dead by the time the city saw its most prominent use, but his contribution to its existence is notable nonetheless. I also wanted to mention Quebec City because of its perfect embodiment of what Champlain was there to do in New France. That is, to trade and war. When reading the Voyages of Champlain, one must keep in mind that all these commentaries, whether they are vivid or curt, are told within the mindset of someone who is scouting the territory from the mouth of the St. Lawrence to Lake Champlain in New York State for better goods, better land, and a potential passage to Asia, which was still a primary concern at the time, albeit one that would get kiboshed not long after the period we're referring to, but still. Quebec City is everything about this to a T, being a trading outpost and, as relations between the French and some native nations tensed up, a military one. Obviously, it would also be used as a military outpost against the British later, and the British would use it, and so on and so forth. But anyway, as I said, he does talk about other matters, including descriptions of the environment and the peoples, but it must always be considered within the context of settlement, right? Who can this settlement help? Why is this a good place to stay here? Etc., etc. And you really get these vivid descriptions with Quebec. In 1609, another great example of the future potential of the land is seen by Champlain in his discovery of the aforementioned lake that was named after him. Much like Quebec City, the strategic importance of this whole region, including the Richelieu River that extends north to south from the St. Lawrence to Lake Champlain, is undeniable. Much like the St. Lawrence provides a westward entry into the continent, the Richelieu River, named Rivière aux Iroquois by Champlain, so Iroquois River, and Lake Champlain provided access to the southern part of the continent into what is now the United States. Once again, the military and economic capabilities of this waterway was understood by Champlain, who would fight multiple battles in places that are now towns and cities in the province of Quebec that are located alongside the Richelieu River in Lake Champlain in order to secure the region for the French. These fights were mostly against the Iroquois and were fought with the help of the Hurons. You might have noticed that I keep mentioning the waterways, such as the St. Lawrence, the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain, so on. I maybe should have mentioned this earlier, but without these natural roads, there was very little chance for Europeans to travel. There was very little chance for natives to travel very far either, for that matter. There were no paved roads, trains, or barely even horses. I mean, the horses would come progressively, but they're not native to North America. You got around by boat and a little bit by foot in the surrounding areas. That's it. And that is why Champlain was arguably so successful in his travels. He would travel and fall upon pieces of territory that were naturally capable of providing excellent points of settlement. Much like Quebec City, towns like Chambly or Saint-Jean and Sorel all started out as stopping points along the only travelable areas of Canada at the time. These places would also follow a similar history of being turned into important fortifications and training grounds before becoming full-on cities and towns. All right. So that was a whole lot of information. I know, I'm sorry. Once again, I'm trying to pack a lot of these 3 volumes into a single episode. I'm starting to realize as I go along that this is maybe not the best idea, but at this point, I'm dedicated to it. But before we move on to Volume 2, I just want to do a brief recap of what I just said. The importance of Volume 1 is not only in what it represents as an introduction to what life looked like in early colonial times when the French started taking over Eastern Canada, but it is also a great introduction for some of the foundational aspects of later Canadian society, even if the French settlers under Champlain didn't know it yet, of course, right? They had no concept of what that colony would become. The horrifyingly harsh winters, the good and terrible relations between Europeans and Native Americans, as well as the establishment of trading and military positions from the Maritimes to Lake Champlain, are all points that will be returned to in later episodes, but that are established within the pages of the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain. While I didn't mention it, we even start to see the setting up of a governing system that would become quite common under colonial America, both for the French and the British, when Champlain becomes a lieutenant in New France, allowing him to represent some of the French crown's power despite being thousands of kilometers away from France. the British would also adopt a similar system, and even to this day, Canada has a Governor General. So these kinds of systems of power remained throughout the centuries. If we move on to Volume 2, we get some better descriptions of everything that I mentioned previously. Champlain takes the time to develop ideas, talk about life within the fortifications of Quebec, the differences in native cultures, surprisingly, and, of course, his continued explorations. By the year 1615, Champlain describes his further adventures into the continent towards the Georgian Bay. I mentioned this specific event in the second volume because it is, of course, a point of battle between the Hurons and Iroquois, once again. But also because it is one of the first times that Champlain actually visits what was the main Huron territory. After all these years of being their ally, he finally reaches their territory, their main nation's territory. Champlain, after having sustained a knee injury due to an enemy arrow piercing it, stayed in the Georgian Bay area during the winter of 1615. His extended time in the region leads to a much fuller description of Huron life. And this is where the passages no longer get lost in vague generalities concerning savages, nor are the natives only reduced to physical measurements. Let's be honest, and let's be very clear here, both of these things are still present, but to a lesser extent. Anyway, we do get a lively impression of life in a longhouse, something that we had barely touched upon before. Champlain notes the children and how they interact with their parents. He marks the fleas that infest part of the houses, the thick smoke that emanates from the living structures that are trying to heat up or that are in the middle of cooking whatever animal was caught during a hunt. We are finally painted a picture of a culture as almost unrelated to Europeans. And this is one of the most detailed accounts that we have of Native American life at such an early stage of colonization. And in spite of the unfortunate legacy that Europeans like Champlain have left as a result of their missions in North America, I must say that this is a unique feat for the time and in and of itself is one worthy of note, independent of whatever happens after, although that's hard to do in historical research and historical thinking. It is also in Volume 2 that we get further indications that a conventional system is being formed, that New France is not as much of a lawless wasteland as one might have expected in relation to these earlier days. Once again, we're inclined to understand this through trade affairs, as Champlain recounts the disputes that were had between himself and the fur trading company that came to New France as well. There is no drama or personal clashes that accompany these sections, but rather we get carefully explained legal positions. Now, I can already hear some people snoring at the mere thought of talking about rules and regulations, but this was clearly something that was important for early settlers. Common grounds needed to be established so as to not descend into anarchy amongst the traders. We are also led to understand something less savory about this type of inclusion in the Voyages, that the Europeans have every intention of staying in this part of the world for long enough that a stable system of governments and law needs to be established. 1615 is once again a date that we can turn to in order to reinforce this idea, when Champlain supported the introduction of Récollet missionaries into the territory in order to proselytize native populations. This introduction of missionaries is actually a huge part of the system that would also grow in Canada as the years went on. Missionaries would go westward and would be an integral part of how the country would develop, for example, in their use in the residential schools, right? Or even in the quote-unquote average school system missionaries and people from religious groups would be, for example, here in Quebec, present as teachers until the 60s, right? It's something that will keep permeating into society and that clearly began in the 16th, 17th century. So I think that's an interesting point and something to take away that's a bit different that you might not expect from Samuel de Champlain's Voyages. As I mentioned at the top of the episode, I want to very briefly touch upon Volume 3, but before we do, we must warn that we have to go into this with a grain of salt, because this is where the bit of revisionism that I mentioned at the start in my introduction comes into play. Because a lot of the writing in it is argued as to whether it was written by Champlain or not by historians, and we'll cover it, but probably most of it is not. First of all, where the two first volumes were written and published pretty close to each other in 1613 and 1619 respectively, this last work was put out almost 15 years after the second one, in 1632. So already right off the bat, we can understand that there might be some contention, because this leaves plenty of time for revisions to be made, or even if it was written by Champlain, plenty of time to forget or misremember aspects of his past adventures. This volume purports to cover the period from 1603 to 1631, which, as you probably noticed, overlaps with the time period covered in the first two volumes. This is because it contains a rewritten version of the Voyages from 1603, and these revisions are most certainly not written by Champlain, or at the very least were not completed by him. The writing style is completely different, and even if that wasn't the case, even if we do accept that, well, suddenly Champlain became a better writer, the contradictions of the text are abundant. Even if you think that Champlain had written this, he contradicts himself and it becomes apparent that it all falls apart. The only new features in this volume are the travels that Champlain went on in 1629 and onward, as well as commentaries on treaties and previous French explorers dating back to the early 16th century. So there's a bit of editorializing that goes on that, once again, wasn't really present in the first two volumes. And so it leads us to think, why would it suddenly change? Why would suddenly Champlain be interested in talking about these previous explorers in ways that he hadn't before? If I'm being honest, it really looks like quite a hasty job of rewriting Champlain's own accounts, and as a consequence, runs into a whole deal of inconsistencies. For example, the Récollet missionaries that we just mentioned as part of Volume 2, that had accompanied early French settlers to New France for conversion purposes, well, they were essentially written out of the narrative altogether. All references that Champlain made to them were suppressed, leaving a significant gap in the writing and in the timeline. Now, this might be because the rewritings were done by a rival missionary group, people that did not believe the same things as the Récollets in terms of Christianity, and that they wanted to remove them from the narrative because they thought it would be more consistent with what their view of the colony was. We don't really know. We don't know who rewrote this. There are a few theories, such as Champlain's I think Champlain's wife is one of the suspects, if you will, and a bunch of other missionary groups. We don't know. Above all, there is a new tone that is instilled in the volume that wasn't present before. And this is a tone that is rather moralizing, but is also smoother in the writing. It stands in stark contrast to the brusque style of the two earlier voyages that simply stated facts without much personality to them, except occasionally, as we mentioned before. Right now, the writing really gets into the flowery affairs and really goes into this more fiction-like writing that Champlain would not have done. That's why I don't really want to talk about Volume 3, because there's so little that we can actually know and cover concerning where Canada will be headed. But if you decide to read these texts, or at least skim over them, go into it knowing that the rule of thumb of this volume is that whenever the voice of the text is condescending, patronizing, or didactic, the suspicion by historians and scholars is that that's the work of a foreign writer. That is not to say that there is no trace of the original explorer in the text. For example, there are passages that speak of the perfect navigator being a God-fearing man, and that is Champlain to a T, right? He would insert these little comments here and there about what makes a good man, a good explorer, and that's kind of consistent. The volume is not completely useless, but it is bizarre. If anything, for example, for a history purpose, we do get mentions of another town that Champlain helped establish, or that at least recommended the establishment of, and that was only built later by a Governor La Violette in 1634, and that is Trois-Rivières, which translates to Three Rivers. And that is because it was a settlement that was established at the convergence of three different rivers. The originality in this one is abundant. But I think that's all there can really be said about Volume 3, simply because anything else would be anachronistic or uncertain, so I don't really want to get too much into it. If you want to read it for yourself, like I said, you can find it online very easily, and it's kind of a fun read if you look at it from a fictitious point of view. So, what is the point of all this? What can we learn about the 3 volumes of the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain? Despite this episode at times feeling like a vague hodgepodge of factoids about the man and his actions, I think that there is something to gather from all of this. I believe that Champlain is an excellent representation of what the European effect was on Canada. I obviously could not cover everything about Champlain's life, but I wanted to contrast some of his better-known actions with the pre-contact life that I described at the start of this episode. Samuel de Champlain was, while being a colonizer, soldier, and businessman above all, was arguably the first European in this part of North America to develop a realistic plan for the exploration and settlement of Canada. This included the formation of necessary relations with some of the native populations, which would sometimes end in trade, sometimes in war, but were always understood as integral to survival in this harsh and unforgiving territory. These relations, when done properly, led to the creation of permanent agriculturally based settlements such as Quebec City, and allowed the Europeans to live off the land. This survival aspect cannot be overstated in the Canadian context, as it is something that will return again and again in relation to nature and identity. Speaking of identity, Champlain's efforts, including many of those described in this podcast, would be integral to creating a French-speaking community in Canada. His settlements in Acadia, Quebec, and Trois-Rivières, along with his continued defense of the colony as its governor, promoted the maintenance of a French culture that remains to this day. As such, it is not a massive stretch to continue attributing him the term founder of New France, which, if you look deeply enough into him, you will see coming up again and again. Now, Samuel de Champlain is not perfect. Not at all, actually. As I've alluded to many times in this episode, his actions directly involved racism towards natives in the terms he used, in the way he treated them, or his actions would lead to terrible behavior in the future of the colony. I'm not here to forgive this, right? I don't want to forgive it. What I want to do is provide a view of history as presented in literature, and I think I managed to vaguely do this in this episode. Many of the books that we are going to talk about have a complicated legacy, and a horrible one at times, but that does not mean that we cannot learn from them. Quite the contrary. If we can learn anything from the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain, it's that Canada has always had rough winters, that its population and culture find its roots in the most unusual of places, and that the past is never quite as far as we sometimes think it is. In a podcast about history through culture, the Voyages of Samuel de Champlain at least deserves to be mentioned for what it represents as a tome, if not for its enduring value as a fascinating read. Now, I did not go into a lot of detail in this episode about the specifics of trade, war, and settlement. This was deliberately done because we are still at the early stages of these events in terms of the larger history of Canada, and Champlain himself does not describe them in a great deal. On the next episode, we will be going into these specifics with Alexander Mackenzie's writing. This will allow us to see what has remained from Champlain's endeavors to settle North America, how the fur trade and how certain societies emerged in the 17th century and concretized themselves in the 18th and 19th centuries once the British had taken over. Is it a bit of a cop-out to leave the denouement to the next episode? Maybe, but I also feel that it makes sense narratively. And in the end, isn't that the point of a literary history podcast? Well, I'll leave that up to you, but I think so. So where Champlain established and set the groundwork, or helped establish it, we're going to see how it all unfolds with Alexander Mackenzie as he travels from one end of the country to another, from one sea to another sea. That being said, I want to thank everyone for listening. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always email them to me at historiacanadiana@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at draftsgalore. If you want to reach out to me there, that's totally fine as well. You can also suggest topics and themes that you would like to hear me explore in the future. That being said, I'll see you next time on Historia Canadiana. Cheers, everyone.